Wales Northern Rivers region. Now, with a series of consecutive flooding disasters, the election is the last thing on a lot of people's minds here. But we'll be looking at whether there's been sufficient support for people and businesses in places like Ballina and Lismore to rebuild, and some of the astonishing ways in which the community came together here to support each other. And we'll be talking about Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter, of course, and ask our panellists what they might do with, say, $61 billion. And joining me on the panel with this glorious view behind us today, Principal of Cabbage Tree Island Public School, Dyonne Anderson. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
Co-founder and Executive Director of Digital Rights Advocacy Group. He's got a bit to say about Elon Musk. It's called Access Now. Brett Solomon, welcome.
Thank you.
Mayor of Ballina Shire Council and Chair of the Northern Rivers Joint Organisation, Sharon Cadwallader, welcome. And Mayor of Lismore City Council, a very busy man, Steve Krieg. Steve, g'day.
Hi, how are you?
Good. And if you want to join in on Twitter, you can using the hashtag The Drum, and we are also on Facebook. Now, as the election campaign rolls on, there are some signs that voters are increasingly disillusioned with both major parties. From the so-called teal independents to more reactionary minor parties, it's increasingly possible that this election could dent the dominance of the historic two-party paradigm. Over the last few weeks, support for the major parties in the polls has been languishing. The number of people saying they'd vote first for Labor is at 37%, while it's 36% for the coalition. When preferences are considered, that moves to 53% for Labor and 47% for the coalition. Now, while there's still more than 3 weeks for both major parties to excite the electorate, some, like the political editor of The Australian, believe time is running out.
While all elections are different, the low primary votes for both the major parties, coupled with two unpopular leaders, continues to demonstrate the depth of modern electoral disillusionment. If the 27% of voters who have parked their votes with minor parties and independents might be looking to shift, they aren't showing any sign of it yet.
Sharon, 27% of voters tending to put their votes with independents or minor parties. Now, you were briefly with the Nationals, but you've run as an independent and have been an independent for many years. Does this shift in the electorate make sense to you?
Look, it doesn't surprise me that those numbers are coming through, because generally I think this is our democratic process. People want to see some changes happening. They're not necessarily comfortable with the way things are panning out, and I think social media's got a big part to play with that, and particularly seeing with the lockdowns that we've seen with COVID, and people have had more time to do a lot of investigating and I guess Facebooking and things like that. So I think that's how a lot of information's being spread, whether that's true, false or indifferent. People are taking more of an interest because they've had more time on their hands. And I believe this is what we're seeing now playing out in those numbers.
But taking a particular kind of interest, so, like away from the major parties. So there's more of a sense of disillusionment or distrust.
Well, they are, but that's also due to the natural disasters that we've seen over the last few years. And we've certainly had our fair share of those, with droughts, with COVID, floods, bushfires, you name it, we've had it. Government has had to deal with such a lot, and you can't make all the people happy all the time. So therefore people have taken a concerted interest in politics, and this is what we're seeing play out. It's very difficult to please everyone when you're trying to manage such disasters.
Now, Steve, someone who has taken an interest in politics, you ran as mayor, suddenly found yourself being signed in January 11 this year. We have seen a lot of independents become mayors. Can you explain that for us?
Oh, for me, I don't want to be aligned with a political party necessarily. I agree with different aspects of each of the parties, but I don't want to be tied down. I'm in my role for the people of Lismore and its villages, not for a party as such. And I think local government in particular is really going to struggle if they align themselves with a political party down the track.
Why?
Because local government especially is a real hands-on form of government. You're close to the people that you are representing and serving. And to have to follow a party line in particular, which might not suit your local government area, I think's asking a bit much. And that's just my personal opinion, obviously. For example, you know, a dam is a hot topic at the moment in our local government area, and it has been for many, many years. Now, I don't want to have to be tied to a particular viewpoint. I want to represent the majority of the people in my electorate to what they want.
You don't want to be bound. It could be also, I mean, we look at some of the polling. I think it was the Australian Financial Review Ipsos poll that found that both candidates from the major parties ranked at the lowest level of competence we've seen in terms of the polling for 27 years. And when it comes to local government, it's about competence, isn't it? About getting stuff done. You can't make a promise and then 3 years later go, oh, right, about that.
Well, I think you're right. And I also think another problem when we're dealing with federal election issues at the moment is that I think both major parties are playing it a bit safe because of the social media impacts. They're very grey candidates, if I can use that term. There's no one person standing up and taking on that statesman's role or taking on that view that, let's say, John Howard took with gun reform or, you know, those sorts of bigger issues. It's very much
politically risky, but also demonstrate courage
Yeah.
at the same time. I just want to bring in Brett Solomon. You were the first executive director of GetUp, which tried to very much, you know, encourage people to think outside the major parties in a lot of way and to generate kind of community activism. How do you interpret these polls?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, what both of the mayors have said, I think, are reflective of the global and also part of an international trend as well, which is that people are concerned about traditional politics, concerned about disillusion by politicians. You know, we've seen the idea that people are diversified. They're not like, I'm Labor, I am Liberal, I'm Green, but I might be socially progressive or economically conservative or a mix of those. And I think when we started GetUp back in the day, that was like trying to create political infrastructure that would respond to the political needs of the population. It wasn't just that you would vote, you know, every 3 or 4 years or whatever the electorate was, that you actually had a say all the time on all of the issues. And we've seen that, as been mentioned, this issue of social media is now Facebooking, as you said, you know, is like, it's so relevant to our lives. People are able to engage with a candidate's position on the Solomon Islands or a candidate's position on inflation or a candidate's position on climate change. And all of those things can manifest themselves in one independent, but not necessarily how people align to one political party.
Dyonne, when we talk about federal election and we look at the different competence or trustworthiness of the major candidates, and it's neck and neck, and there's kind of gotcha moments and a whole heap of pundits offering different viewpoints and analyses, does this seem at all relevant to the day-to-day struggles that you have?
I think currently with what everyone is dealing with on a local basis, the election is important, but I think we are just attempting to deal with the day-to-day struggles. I need to know that our communities need to know that they have food, that they have accommodation, that they are being taken care of. They know where they're going to be sleeping tomorrow night. So we have all of these bigger issues happening within federal, but if I actually speak to community as well and I ask them, how are they feeling about the types of support that have been offered, I know that they feel let down. I know that there is a common thread around knowing that people are looking for photo opportunities, which is not necessarily within the best interest of the community, and taking in consideration what our community is really dealing with. So it's not as though it's not a spoken topic, but I think we have to be realistic about what our priorities are at the moment. We need our families and community well taken care of, and not empty promises. And I think we've seen some empty promises, especially of late, around what is needed. We don't need people to tell our community what they need. They need to start listening so that we're getting the right appropriate support. And the disappointment around the coalition not even taking a moment to speak to people on the ground, that's just not good enough. People don't forget that. That is part of why we are struggling with thinking about what is the right step forward. Who knows? You're putting trust into people who make empty promises.
I want to come back to that question of support. Actually, I want to talk about it now because here in the New South Wales Northern Rivers region, frustration with politics, as Dyonne is saying, has a very specific focus. Hit by 2 major floods in as many months, locals are struggling to navigate funding support. There are a number of different state and federal grants available, but there's confusion about what to access and how. And there's also the question of when money might flow, with reports last week only 2% of the back home grants offering residents up to $20,000 to repair their properties have been processed. This morning I headed over to ABC Radio North Coast in Lismore to hear from locals, alongside breakfast host Joanne Shoebridge, about how government support has been received. Well, the switchboard lit up.
This is ABC North Coast.
Julia, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Northern Rivers.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. We really wanted to come here to get a sense of what actually is going on. Do people have enough support? It's been like an incredibly traumatic and difficult experience. And are we hearing everything that's really happening?
Let's go now to some of our callers.
I feel like I've been abandoned by the government, and when I have to deal with government departments, it's just like they are on some kind of go slow, and I just get caught up in their red tape.
Is that both federal and state government?
Yes, both. I've lost over $25,000 worth of equipment, and I can't even get them to answer the phone. I'm just still waiting. It's just infuriating.
Let's go to Chloe from Lismore. Just tell us a little bit about your story and your parents' story.
So they were just trying to get some assistance from the government. Obviously, they were flood affected. They'd lost their house, their business. They had no power, no computers. So they were with Centrelink at the desk, and he explained to them that they were wasting his time and Centrelink's time because they should have done this online. So they were quite distraught about that. My parents had never been Centrelink customers before.
Right. So you're really, part of your story is the fact, people who are not really used to asking the government for support, who are not used to going through these systems and suddenly finding that they're not treated with the respect or urgency that the situation might ask for.
Yeah, and it's emotional too. Like each time you've got to relive and almost prove your case.
Look, I just feel like we're just living through this gigantic experiment. The rain event was like nothing that we've seen before. The emergency response turned out to be almost experimental in its nature. The cleanup is mind-blowing.
Very uncomfortable feeling like you're in the middle of an experiment.
As much as Lismore is a flood town, we are not the only flood town. If you believe the science, it's almost inevitable that one day an event like that we've lived through and we are living through is going to happen again.
James from Lismore.
On the morning of the flood, we were picked off the roof of our home. So we've lost everything in the house. We've lost our entire business. I've thrown out approximately $400,000 to $500,000 worth of high-end catering equipment. And I've thrown out in excess of $60,000 worth of food and product. And it's slowly killing our town. I know families that are leaving this town, and so those kids leave town with their families, so there's need for a few less teachers in the schools, so that's people who are suddenly not in your community going out to buy a new set of tyres for their car or taking their family out for a family event dinner, and the town starts to die. And that, I'm afraid, is what we're seeing, and unless we find a way to change the way Lismore responds to these events, then I fear we are consigning Lismore to a slow death.
Just a deluge of callers we had this morning, Steve. A lot of people saying they feel frustrated and overwhelmed as well as traumatised, and a sense that they're trying to access support and it's difficult, that politicians have come and made announcements, but it's taking a long time for the support to come through. Does that ring true with your experience, with what you're seeing on the streets and the homes?
Unfortunately, it does. I've met with many politicians from both sides of politics, and they do come with announcements, which is really great. But the time it takes from the announcement being made to it actually coming to fruition seems to be taking a long time. And there also seems to be a lot of different avenues that you have to go through to access these grants or this support, which is frustrating. I know myself, you know, our office, which was 12.5 metres above floodwater height, obviously went underwater. There goes our filing system, our computer system, all of those sorts of things. So when they're asking for serial numbers off your coffee machine or different things like that, you just don't have it. We're literally doing all of our communications on our mobile phones because that's all we have.
And Steve, you were living on the property of your business as well, right? So you've been displaced too. So how's that process been? I know when we contacted you today, you were getting a dehumidifier.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to comprehend, and even when you come to Lismore or one of the affected areas to visit, it's the little things that you don't understand. And as I said, like, you know, people have offered to buy us things like sheet sets or towels or something. We don't have a bathroom, we don't have a bed to put on a sheet. You know, we've got some beautiful friends in the town next door to us in Casino that brought us a washing basket full of clothes because you literally don't have underwear or socks. So
you didn't have thongs.
Didn't have a pair of thongs. Didn't have a, you know, it's those little things that you take for granted every single day that thousands upon thousands of people have to rebuild. That the comprehension of that is really hard to portray through a TV screen or a journalistic report. And even 5 minutes up the road in Cadwallader, you know, in an area that wasn't affected, you know, the thing that made me cry the most directly after the flood was watching a guy mow his lawn, because they're the little things that you just literally take for granted in your day-to-day life.
The normalcy of it.
Yeah.
Just out with a mower.
Yep.
And that would have grown so much during the rains as well. Sharon, I'm interested in your view on the political response. If I can just read a couple, because we got texts this morning when we were on ABC local radio as well. Someone saying, Robin texted to say they felt they weren't as bad as others were, but they were up to no income for 12 months, at least $60,000 in repairs. Chris said he's still shocked to drive past houses to see people living in their front yards in a camper trailer, and he worries about the upcoming winter.
Yes, look, firstly, the rollout is problematic, and just as Steve's pointed out, losing your computer, you may not be that computer savvy anyway, and that's why the recovery centres have been set up. And you can go to the recovery centres and you can have somebody there put in the information on a computer for you. There is help at the recovery centres. We'd all love it to be rolled out a lot faster, but I guess staffing shortages as well is another thing. Is there enough staff out there to help with this recovery effort? I would imagine that's probably part of the problem, and accommodation for people in our area as well, because accommodation is a problem, as we've heard from Dyonne, with people trying to be accommodated. Thankfully, we've got the pods rolling out this week, and Ballina Shire is the first to be rolled out. That temporary accommodation, which is great, and it should be the first also. First priority is rolling that out. But with the funding allocations, there is a process that has to be followed, and it, as Steve said too, it's about ticking boxes and making sure that everything's compliant.
But isn't that when a disaster really calls? It's like calling for an emergency situation, right? Things need to happen quickly because there are lives on the line. Isn't that a point where the bureaucracy should streamline effectively, dramatically, quickly?
Well, we saw that in the first rollout.
You saw that?
Automatically. Every adult got $1,000 and every eligible child got $400. We saw the second rollout of $2,000 to every, another 2 weeks' payments to every adult and $800 to every child. That was an immediate rollout. which was very welcome.
Yeah, sorry, Brett.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I think we've been prepared, we should have been prepared for this over many years now. You know, there's been report after report about the vulnerability in the community, about the lack of preparedness, about the underfunding of mitigation strategies. All of this has been in place. And yes, it's great that $1,000 has come through, but where does $1,000 go when you need to buy a bed and or if you're an Indigenous person and you've lost access to land? I mean, and I think that, in my current role at Access Now, I've been involved in many disaster responses, whether it be related to political or environmental, and the bureaucracy has to step to the side. Like, we have to, if the money is in the bank from the government or from the different departments, the main objective is to get the money from that bank account to that bank account, or that service to the person in need.
Where have you seen that happen in the right way?
That's a good question. I mean, I actually have never seen it done brilliantly. I know when I was in Coracai the other day, like, you could see, volunteering in a very small way compared to some of the volunteering activities that people have been engaged in. But you could see, like, a whole car park full of tanks and trucks and a whole tent full of bottled water. But when you go around the street and speak to people, and they're like, they don't have any of that water. They don't have any of, or there's like 400 tins of beans, that don't necessarily relate to what the need of the community is. And I think going forward, because we need to go forward and we need to think constructively, is how do we recognise that this is not the last flood? Unfortunately, this is not the last fire. We're in climate change breakdown crisis at the moment, and we need to streamline all of the systems in anticipation of these things coming and happening again, and perhaps worse.
Dyonne, can you tell us, what happened in your community? You have such a pivotal role as the principal of the school there. There's so many people that I'm sure that have come to you for advice and sought your leadership on this. Can you tell us what happened on Cabbage Tree Island and what happened to the school?
So on the Monday, our community was actually evacuated. I think that was the 28th of February. And our community on the ground were hoping that the island was going to be okay. Had been through many floods, but I think once everyone saw what was happening in Lismore on Ballina Road, tears started to stream. Everyone knew that it wasn't going to be a great outcome further down. And I do know that we had Jarlee Aboriginal Land Council, we had community transport who came in and were assisting in evacuating people off the island. There was a very short time frame to be able to get people off. We've got one way on, one way off the island. And certainly, when you've got elders, you've got community members who are fragile, who are unwell, it's a really big deal to be taken from your home and not knowing where you're going to end up, for how long. And there was a bit of resistance and concern. So, if it wasn't for the local community on the ground, I'm fearful of what might have happened within our community around the safety of elderly people. Talking about processes, I know that when our community was evacuated and taken into Ballina, our community was taken to a whole range of different locations, and there were people who were split up from carers and other family members. No, you can't go there. It took hours to have people registered to find a home, over a temporary accommodation, even for overnight. And that just wasn't okay when people were already dealing with a crisis. The processes just weren't adequate. We had 190 people from our community where we should be able to be together and look at how we can put support structures in place to make sure they're already in trauma, dealing with a crisis. Let's not traumatise more by having unnecessary paperwork to make sure that someone has a bed, a roof over their head. There are ways that we need to do it better. And I'm hearing stories from our community where, people, single mums, families are lining up for 2 hours. I know they've received the $1,000 relief funding. $1,000 does not go very far at all. We're talking about families who've been displaced for 6, 7, 8 weeks, and they're lining up for 2 hours to find that by the time they get to the front of the line, oh, sorry, there's no funding available. Which funding are we talking about? There's so much confusion around all the different funding sources. It changes from week to week, and our community's just not trusting the system, in that you put time and effort to look to see what support's in place, and then you're let down. Why am I going to go back and deal with that and relive that experience over and over again? And there's a sense that there are people who are genuine in need of support, who are being questioned so severely, it's not worth the interrogation and the scrutiny of what they have to deal with.
So much additional stress to go through the process. I just want to bring Sharon in, because I know you were wanting to jump in before.
I'd just like to... I was at the evacuation centre when Cabbage Tree Island was evacuated at the Richmond Room, and there were animals coming through as well. Yes. Chris Binge was fantastic, the way we had an elderly resident that didn't want to leave without her dogs, and he went back and he assisted her in leaving there. We had community and justice there going through the process of getting accommodation. Everybody did have to be registered because we had to know where they were and who was where they were. So we did, at the end of everybody that the motels were full, we then had to look at alternate accommodation. So I rang the local government minister, Wendy Tuckerman, and asked her to help. We still had 70 residents unable to be housed in motels. So she actually brought on the state government facility at Lennox Head, and I was very grateful for that, because we were able to put everybody together. And so I believe that we were doing as much as we possibly could.
It still sounds like there's room
to try and bring everybody together.
I think it's very important that we take time to actually go back and listen and take a moment to really reflect on what could be improved upon. Some of the temporary accommodation was of concern as well for our families. We had elders and we had families with little children. Where they were staying, they felt unsafe. There were additional people who had been housed there temporarily as well. And I know that our community didn't want to leave their rooms because they felt unsafe in some of the locations, and then they were then relocated again. I've got families who have been relocated 5, 6 times over the last few weeks with 5, 6, 7 children. And who needs that? I know it's not their fault, and I'm not blaming the people on the ground, but there are ways that we need to streamline processes so that it is less traumatic, and we are really looking at the compassion of how we deal with people who are in crisis. And I would also stress that there needs to be a bigger conversation around the vulnerabilities of difference in our community. So I know that around flood relief, around some of the supports in place, what's been happening for the non-Aboriginal community and what's been happening for the Aboriginal community, they are not aligning. The mismatch is very concerning, in that you don't treat one group of people this way and then you treat the other group that way. You have choice, you don't. If there's an event that's happened and there's been concern about behaviour within locations, who does the finger get pointed to? The Aboriginal community, and it has been wrongfully done so. So there are all these other added stresses which are causing great concern and trauma on trauma. So if we can get these processes in place around flood relief, I know that that's going to benefit community.
And I've got to say, Dyonne, sorry, it highlights to me the scale and the magnitude of the disaster that we're living through, in the fact that there's no quick fix to this. You can't be evacuated one day and expect to be back in your home in the next week or two, because we're looking at years for a community like Cabbage Tree to be rebuilt.
Steve, can I just ask you very quickly, because I need to move on, but just the Northern Rivers Reconstruction Corporation, how much of a hope is it that this will be a pivot point? This will be a moment where things can change and be better coordinated?
Well, the hope is that it will cut through a lot of this red tape that everyone seems to be talking about and dealing with, to have one central organisation coordinating what seems, while you're living through it, the dozens of different groups that you have to appeal to and beg for assistance from. Hopefully this corporation is the one organisation that is the coordinating body of that. People who have lost their home or have lost their business or who have been relocated can contact and get certainty.
One point to go to. Okay. Look, as we've been hearing, the response from locals to government support has been decidedly mixed. And we know that when the floods first hit back in February, both the federal and state governments copped flack for the speed in which emergency responders were mobilised. Back then, the community stepped in, and in many cases, they haven't stopped, with volunteers working around the clock to keep flood-affected residents fed, sheltered and supported. Reporter Stephanie Bolchi was in Lismore to meet some of the community support groups to see how they're going.
On February 28, Lismore residents stepped up to save strangers from the torrent of water engulfing their community.
There's someone being rescued right now, actually. We'll just pan over. This is the sort of community spirit that we've been seeing here throughout all day, hours and hours on end. Volunteers and authorities have been going back and forth on boats, rescuing people that have been stuck at their submerged homes from all hours of the night.
After the flood waters subsided, the streets were buzzing with workers. Now, 2 months on, much of the debris has gone, but the work hasn't. It's clear, though, the heart of this community hasn't been lost, reinforced by the donated banners strung up across affected businesses and homes. With a lack of skilled tradies, owners are having to do the work themselves, or are turning to organisations like Resilient Lismore that was set up after the last big flood in 2017. Here they coordinate volunteers, connecting the community through social media, but also offering free cleaning products and tools.
The government has put forward lots of money. We appreciate that, but right now we need that factored in to be also people power and actual workers to come as well.
Organisers at this charity say that they need more than 700 skilled labourers to fill just the 500 jobs they already have on their books. Lucas and Tobin have travelled from Melbourne and Coffs to help out.
Helping people secure their houses is the big priority, like lock their front and back doors, fix up their windows, just to help them be a bit more secure.
I'm an arborist. I mean, there's lots of flood. When you have water and wind and rain, trees lose limbs, they lose structure, they fall over. There's definitely an element that I'm willing to help with that, but also just basic help as well.
Sarah has been volunteering at the hub for about 6 weeks, trying to coordinate the assistance.
We have the ability to help, we have an amazing system in place that we're using, but not the right people to be helping. It does hurt.
And still, a month after the second major flood, securing enough food is proving difficult for a lot of people. This is one of the community kitchens set up after the floods 2 months ago. Since then, they've served up about 100,000 meals and the need hasn't gone away. In fact, the Koori Kitchen volunteers are seeing families who hadn't come before.
We're actually seeing more of the community come in because a lot of people were staying with family or had to live, with friends, but are now kind of 6, 7 weeks, 8 weeks coming back into their houses. The production-wise has grown, like we're doing over 1,000 meals a day.
Without running water and electricity, many locals are turning to the Koori Kitchen for a bite to eat and a chat.
Every day someone comes here and they just grab you and say, I just want to say thank you. Maybe they haven't had a hot meal for 2 days because they've been cleaning and they forget to eat.
Steve, some really astonishing stories there about community support. And we keep hearing about how people returning to Lismore, but there's no running water, no electricity, and they're continuing to need to have meals and that kind of support. How long do you think that's going to go on for?
I'm hoping, like I know that there's running water now. We had major infrastructure and we've got infrastructure problems that are going to confront us for the next 12 to 18 months. There's no question about that. But, you know, getting the basic needs, the water, I know Essential Energy have done an outstanding job to restore power to, I thought Easter was their deadline to try and even get the CBD back up and running as far as electricity goes. Problem now is that buildings have electricity, now they have to be certified by an electrician.
Right.
And as we've all heard, there's a real tradie shortage. So getting those level 2 electricians to come in and certify your home and reconnect the power properly is really the hold up. And so, yeah, you know, the scale, as I keep saying, the scale and magnitude of what we're living through is enormous. And thousands upon thousands of homes, businesses that are living off one PowerPoint until they get that certification.
Right, and we drive along the streets of Lismore and you'll see somewhere that's boarded up and empty. Looks like the structure's in place, but inside we know how much damage has been and how much rebuilding of things like electricity. Now, we've seen the stories of the volunteers, Sharon, from the very beginning, and I know that you've still hearing stories of people that were out rescuing others for hours and hours and going for days without sleep, looking after other people. It also makes it hard with this kind of community. It's really bonded people together at a time when, as we know, we're about to talk about Twitter, there's so much polarisation and division culturally. To have moments when a community comes together is really powerful. Does that make it then difficult to have conversations about, do we need to relocate? Do we need to rebuild in a different way? Should a CBD be off the floodplains? But are they the conversations we need to be having?
Well, relocating, particularly for Lismore, is a matter for Lismore, not for me and Ballina, but predominantly the communities right around the Northern Rivers have shone brightly. As leaders of the community, I'm sure all our mayors could not be prouder than what has happened, how it's been community supporting community, and it goes on. There's fatigue out there. There's lots of people going over and above, still doing things. Only yesterday I heard of someone that wants to remain anonymous. Initially, I set up a volunteer effort in the very early days of the disaster, and what we were doing was door knocking to see what people needed, and then another team would go out and provide what they needed. And I heard that one of the volunteers is still working with someone who is providing white goods for people anonymously. There's so much activity going on out there. We see all the flood rescues in Lismore. We had those same boat rescues in Ballina, Shire, and it was only last week I heard of someone that was rescuing boats, people from Pimlico into Wardell, into the evacuation centre there. So a lot of
tough questions about the rebuild, about a vision for what the future looks like in terms of vegetation or rewilding, or different housing developments, different planning and mitigation and adaptation.
Right. Well, the Reconstruction Corporation, I think, is a really good step forward. Whilst we've got 7 committees that sit underneath that Reconstruction Committee, they all deal with separate things like land contamination, health and well-being, infrastructure.
But your view about any of those policies?
Absolutely. Well, they're all specialist areas which need to be dealt with individually. The Reconstruction Corporation will sit over the top of that and have cut through with red tape. It will have cut through with planning, whatever it takes, whatever needs to be done to activate things happening quickly. Be that getting people back to their homes, rebuilding their homes, social housing.
I just want to bring Steve in as well, because we were just talking about Lismore CBD. Now, you're not in favour of it being relocated, is that right?
Oh no, but I'm stubborn. And
Tell us why. Would it save a lot of heartache? Were tough decisions like that made?
I think you've got to look at it a little bit holistically as well. I keep harping on that 28th of February was a natural disaster. Lismore's designed around a floodplain because we are on a floodplain. We can deal with flooding. Most people can deal with a 12-metre flood, which is higher than the previous recorded height. What we got was a monster of 14.37 metres. And to take an isolated flood event like that, and you know, I know what people will say, well, it's climate change and all of this sort of thing, expect more and bigger.
Right.
I accept the science of climate change, but I also...
But you wouldn't use the word isolated then if you're
Lismore
talking about
is the most
climate
flooded
change.
town in Australia, and that's a fact. And we can deal with floods.
Mm.
If this was a standard 10.5 metre, 11 metre flood, Cabbage Tree would be safe, Ballina wouldn't have got inundated, and Lismore would be back up and running as if nothing had happened.
That didn't happen.
I know it didn't happen.
Brett, yeah, sorry, do you want to hear Brett?
I think we need to think, 21st century thinking, which is like the unexpected is now to be expected. The 14.5, the 16.5 metre, whatever. I also just wanted to, and that provides us with an opportunity to revision. There's people like Mark Swivel in Byron Council who's just been issuing essays on how do we think about solar panels, how do we think about community gardens, how do we think about stormwater drainage, how do we think about public transport, how do we think about CBDs perhaps being put in the wrong location, and to bring it back to Bundjalung Nation, where Bundjalung Nation people were, shipped off to be relocated over in places where they, didn't necessarily know the person who was living next door and separated at the wrong time. We need to come back, I think, also to Indigenous knowledge, which is about, how do we live with the land? There's highways that go through wetlands. Right now, there's two major proposals that have been passed in Byron West, which are on wetlands, and there's like major high density living that's being proposed there. The community said no, the council said no. It went to the Land and Environment Court and they said yes, it was in the interest of the people. So I think that there's an opportunity now to really rethink the way that we relate to land, the way that we communicate to each other, the way that, through Twitter and other mechanisms which we'll talk about later, but the way in which we actually cohabitate. And I think Indigenous learning and Indigenous people need to be at the centre.
What would Indigenous learning be in terms of living with a flood environment? Because these are, again, like weather patterns we haven't necessarily experienced before and we won't be able to predict.
So I suppose they're bigger conversations. First of all, I'm pleased that we can have a conversation to acknowledge the strength and significance of thousands and thousands of years of experience around Indigenous knowledges. It's not a conversation that we often have, and it's one that should be led by Aboriginal people. So, I know that there are some amazing examples of what those strengths look like. And for Cabbage Tree Island, we need to be considering, what that could look like for us to be flood safe. Doesn't mean that we would be flood free, but we need to be looking at a whole range of different ways. And I know that conversation has already started with, that's being led by Jarlee Aboriginal Land Council around what some of that would need to look like on Cabbage Tree Island, around how we would reuse some of the land, how we would have to relocate places to a whole range of other different areas. But, they're just the conversations that have begun. But I totally agree that these are conversations we need to make the space, but they need to be led by Aboriginal people. And it's not just Indigenous knowledges around climate change or around what our local environment needs to look like. They're bigger conversations that we need to be having in education as well, so that we're really valuing and acknowledging our First Nations expertise.
Well, tell us about your community, because you're not going to be able to be living on the island for some time, right? Because all the rebuilding that needs to occur. What's been happening in terms of finding a place where people can live together and stay together?
in regards to accommodation.
Or the relocation of the school, those kinds of things, yeah.
So it's all fragmented. We have community members who are staying in a whole range of different locations. Our school is now temporarily located at Southern Cross Distance Ed. So I'm very pleased that I'm actually on site and supported by another Aboriginal principal. You know, that cultural safety is especially important at this time. We have the alternative pathways of distance ed, unfortunately, for a number of our children who don't seem to excel within the mainstream, and it's not that our children aren't the right fit, it's that we need to look at systems and institutions and structures that actually take into consideration the strengths of our children. So it was just a really good fit.
You've had meetings this week, haven't you? About
so we've had our parent and community meeting, and lots of other community members came, as well as our parents and carers. And it was to be an hour meeting, which turned into 2.5 hours, which would have probably been a 6-hour meeting, just because we needed to be together. And that was the true sense of what was coming out of the conversations. We set circles, so it was about healing. It was an opportunity for everyone to come together. And I just set up and facilitated conversations so that people felt safe. And it was absolutely heartbreaking to hear about the struggles and what people are dealing with, and knowing that what was just needed and necessary was a space to stay connected, to be together, because we've got people spread out all over. We've got children who are crying, who want to be back home. We've got children who are not sleeping in their own beds, who are turning up to a huge, enormous school. That's very welcoming for us, but it's just not Cabo. So, you know, when I hear the mental health from our community, people are struggling big time. And I'm very concerned about the possibility of suicide when you are displaced, when you just feel helpless. I know that talking with our community, that I've got parents and community members who are saying, it just feels like the old days. We've got no control over our lives. Right. And it's really disturbing that we've got a resilient community, no doubt, but there are others who just are struggling day to day.
Which is what makes meetings like that so important, as you were describing before. Started off in tears, then you ended up laughing together.
And we had
it's just
the best laugh. Yeah, so that's all part of healing.
Right.
And we're going to continue to do that on a regular basis because we need to, and that's come from listening to community.
Another community that some people do or do not listen to is on Twitter. I really want to end today by talking about the fact that tech billionaire Elon Musk has clinched a deal to buy Twitter for 61 billion Australian dollars. The transaction will make the company private and shift control of the social media platform, populated by millions of users, to the world's richest person. Now, this is a big moment for one of the world's most influential public squares and has raised questions about wealth, media power and about free speech.
This deal is dangerous for our democracy. Billionaires like Elon Musk play by a different set of rules than everyone else, accumulating power for their own gain. We need a wealth tax and strong rules to hold big tech accountable.
But Musk himself cites free speech as the reason for his purchase, having previously complained about Twitter's moderation of posts it deemed hateful or disinformation. It's a view which has found significant support among conservative voices.
Is Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter a good thing? Yes. No, I hate free speech.
Brett Solomon, thank goodness you're here. Okay, the richest man in the world, a massive platform like Twitter, what could possibly go wrong? What's this going to mean?
I mean, it is, you know, following on from this discussion here, which has been very local, but also have global implications, of course, with climate change. This is a global discussion that is also going to have a global development that's going to have such significant implications. I think not everybody uses Twitter, so that's fair. There's about 300 million people who are using Twitter in varying degrees right now, but it's really that much of the political narrative, the global debate, the discussions at council, things that define the public policy happen on Twitter. And so it's such an important part of contemporary life and how our societies are developed, geopolitics, the future of the US election, like the list goes on and on. So when you have a private person who owns the tech platform, it raises very serious questions about governance. Like how is this town hall square, which you kind of indicated, it's the new square, how is it going to be governed? And we know from Elon Musk that he has a very poor track record, both in terms of corporate governance, but also his position on freedom of speech. So there's a lot of unanswered questions. I think many of us who've worked in the tech space and at the intersection of tech and human rights have cautioned for many years about the role of the corporate tech sector. When it's in public hands, it makes it just that little bit better. When it's a unilateral decision owned by one particular person who has that track record, there will be very serious consequences. And I can talk about some of them, including the issue of freedom of speech.
Yeah, I'm interested in the idea of if there are no controls. Obviously, that globally we're moving to more regulation or attempts at regulation of these kinds of platforms. What would you envisage happening?
I mean, we've seen what happens. Actually, Twitter started in that position, and many of the tech companies did, where it was sort of like a Wild West, where there was, tech solutionism was going to answer many of the world's ills. In fact, just a few years later, we saw what we've been calling social media genocide that happened in Myanmar to one of our neighbours in Burma, whereby social media, which was unregulated in the country, ended up being a place for incitement to violence and incitement to genocide. And we saw 700,000 people, talking about relocation, crossing borders in order to escape the hate of the dominant population. I think that we know what happens when we have an under-regulated or under-managed space. Twitter right now has community standards. It has a trust and safety team. It has a content governance team, which are doing the best that they can do. And in fact, Twitter's done much better than some of the other platforms on exactly this issue. We know that Elon Musk has a history of silencing his opponents, so he will have access to all of the information and data of all of the people who are on the platform, including those who he is opposed to. And in the absence of internal corporate standards and external regulation, it's a very, very worrying, deeply worrying moment that we're in right now.
Tell us about the fact that you want some human rights assessment done of this purchase. Is that even possible?
Yeah, well, many of us in this area have worked for over the last 10 years to try and bring human rights standards to tech companies. It's absolutely essential that the tech sector understands that it has massive human rights implications. I mean, we've seen just with the pandemic, it's not just about right to freedom of expression and opinion, but it's about right to healthcare, about right to education, about right to a livelihood. All of these things happen in the online environment. And so we have had some success, quite a lot of success, at trying to bring the human rights framework online, trying to train the tech companies to understand the human rights implications of their platforms, and to have policies and practices that are in place in order to limit the negative impacts and promote the positive ones. And so with respect to the purchase and the sale, we have of this platform, we have a whole range of investors who are providing the money. We have a board within the platform. We have Twitter employees, and they're all leveraging points to call for this human rights impact standards or assessment to take place, and then for it to be public, transparent, and then acted upon.
Steve, what would you do with $61 billion?
I could rebuild a city.
Right, and then some.
Pretty easily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to wrap your head around, isn't it? Having
that
kind of finance, especially when we're talking about what $1,000 what difference that can make in someone's life.
Yeah, but through whatever means he's used, he's made that money, and I'm sure he's got the right to spend it how he wishes. And as we've seen, he wants to venture to space and do all sorts of things. And at the moment, I didn't even know about the purchase until I was in the car talking to your people about it.
Yeah,
I've got other things on my mind.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. But I think the thing is that it's not just about him being a rich man and therefore can decide how he spends it. It has such significant consequences for the world. Like if we look, if Musk decides to allow Trump back on the platform, it could influence who is the president of the United States.
Tell us why. For people who aren't Twitter, there's a lot of people who aren't
sorry.
Twitter.
Well, that's what I was saying, is you don't need to be part of on the platform. But the thing is that, you know, Trump has around, I think, 80 million...
80-something,
Yeah, 80 million followers. He's able to communicate directly with his followers, spreading false news, the big lie, for example, that the election... The insurrection, all of this happened on a lot of this happened on the Twitter platform. And so Trump has tried to set up his own platform, and so far unsuccessfully. I think that, you know, when you think about the most important election in the world and the most influential person in the world, probably, you know, it's the President of the United States. But it may well be the owner of Twitter. And I think that's the interesting thing for Musk, is that he's now the richest man, and it is a deft move to buy Twitter because he knows that he can become the most powerful man in the world by owning that platform where much of that debate and discussion happens.
Sharon.
Isn't that scary? Right. To just think about that we are controlled by a social media platform. We are controlled in our decision-making.
In ways we don't even fully understand a lot of the time.
I just think that is such a scary thing, and we see that playing out all the time.
But does it go back to the initial discussion we're having in this show about distrust of major parties and of systems of governance and things not getting done and incompetence, and into that vacuum can come all kinds of theories? I know you're very wary about Twitter, Dyonne.
Yeah, and I think it just reinforces that imbalance of power. Who has the voice, who doesn't? I'm not a regular user of Twitter, distorts the truth, and that, you know, is just something that I probably need to delve in a bit deeper to have some influence within that space. But yeah, just concerned about who has control and who doesn't have a voice. And you know, we continue to have those rich, eccentric people ruling and making big decisions that impact us all. And as First Nations people, we have very little impact on that. That imbalance of power is very, very concerning.
And the thing is, if we all got off Twitter, it wouldn't exist anymore. It needs its users more than anything. All right, unfortunately. Yeah, I'll go first. Okay, I am on Twitter. Is all we have time for tonight. I want to thank our panel, Dyonne Anderson, Brett Solomon, Sharon Cadwallader and Steve Krieg. Thanks so much, all. Such a delight to have you. You can have Ellen back with you tomorrow. I hope you have an excellent evening. Enjoy the view. Good night.